Everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's National Arts Club program. My name is Catherine Kliszewski. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we are a 501c3 nonprofit based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and readings. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nacnyc.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Following the conversation will be a brief Q&A, so please feel free to use the chat or Q&A function for any questions you might have. Today, we are diving into the iconic style of the Beatles and exploring how their fashion helped shape music, culture, and an entire generation. To guide us through the fascinating story, we're thrilled to be joined by acclaimed author Deirdre Kelly. Let me tell you a little bit about her. Deirdre is the author of Fashioning the Beatles, The Looks That Shook the World, a must read on how four musicians became a global style icon. She began her career as an award-winning dance critic, pop music columnist, and senior fashion reporter at the Globe and Mail, and continues to contribute internationally as a correspondent for Dance Gazette in London and other publications. She's also the author of Paris Times 8 and Ballerina, Sex, Scandal, and Suffering Behind the Symbol of Perfection. We are so excited to have her with us today. Please welcome Deirdre Kelly. Hello.
Hello, and thank you so much for this wonderful privilege and honor. Sorry I can't see all of you in person, and actually you can't see me in person. I've had a small technical problem with my camera, but as I was saying to Catherine in advance, you don't want to look at me. You want to look at these guys. This is my book, Fashioning the Beatles, The Looks That Shook the World. It is the first book to take a deep dive into the Beatles' fashion choices and to analyze their enduring impact, not only on fashion in their day, in the 1960s, a decade which they virtually dominated, but how their style choices continue to influence and shape fashion today. So let's get into what made them so sensational and why we are still wanting to talk about them nearly 60 years after their very first appearance, as you see here in America on February 11, 1964, on the Ed Sullivan Show. It wasn't just their sound that riveted nearly 73 million viewers that night, a record. It's often been quipped there was no crime in New York that night because everybody wanted to see this really new, unusual ensemble from across the water from England. And as I've noted from people I've interviewed who watched the show that night, indeed, it wasn't just the music. In fact, it was more how they looked, the hair, the suits, the boots, the whole ensemble. It was something no one before had actually seen. And the Beatles weren't always as sophisticated or as lean and trim in their silhouette. This image here is the Beatles in the very early incarnation as the Silver Beatles on their very first tour of Scotland. You might recognize the principals here, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, that's Stu Sutcliffe, the first bassist with his back, and that drummer there who's not dressing alike like the others is a gun for hire Tommy Moore. It's a sub-story of the Beatles. They always had trouble retaining a drummer until they got Ringo Starr. But you can see that the Beatles, even at the beginning, had an eye for style or fashion, that they knew that to dress in a uniform way would make them cleave as a band and give them an identity. But it was after they met this gentleman, Brian Epstein, in their very hometown of Liverpool, who helped them transition to the smart silhouette that I just showed you on the Ed Sullivan Show. In a way, he's almost replicating or echoing what the Beatles would become. And in fact, when he first persuaded the Beatles to change their outfits, and why did he do that? Because at the time, the Beatles were performing in a literal cellar, in a basement, a former fruit and vegetable market in Liverpool on Matthew Street. And the idea was, after 283 performances and gathering crowds who were already becoming the very first Beatlemaniacs, the idea is that if you wanted to go higher, literally out of that basement, you had to dress the part. You had to dress to be able to go onto the bigger stage, which at the time was the nascent media of television. It was Brian who brokered the introduction with this gentleman who was the Beatles, I would say, among the first tailors. There were a couple of early tailors, one of them being Benno Dorn in Liverpool, Brian's own tailor, but it was this gentleman, Dougie Millings, who really catapulted the Beatles into that early Beatlemania style that we all, I hope, love. I do anyway, and that we are still drawing inspiration from. So Dougie Millings was from Manchester. He was a tailor, and he was known before the Beatles met him as Tailor to the Stars, having outfitted the Shadows and other bands, Cliff Richard, in Liverpool. He was strategically located next door to this coffee bar. You see, it's a coffee bar, but I've been in it. It's still standing in Soho. You go down the stairs, and there is a stage about the size of the proverbial postage stamp. But this is where the very first rock bands or rock ensembles and skittle bands, and then eventually jazz and blues. I mean, Eric Burdon and the Animals played there. The Stones would go there. The Beatles went there. So why I said this is strategically placed and why I wanted to draw attention to it is this is the beginning of the symbiotic relationship between rock and fashion as we know it from Britain, where the tailors situated themselves immediately next door. And so what would happen is at night, the musicians would come out and they would peruse the windows, and, they would dress in the style. They would come and perform. Then the fans would want to dress like their idols or the rockers, and on it goes. It became a very interesting, as I say, symbiotic relationship from the get-go. Dougie Millings is credited. I spoke to his son, Gordon Millings, for my book. He said that his father created 500 looks for the Beatles. Now, that might seem enormous, but you have to remember that many of their outfits were made in quadruplet. There were people stealing from them. They're trophy hunters. You couldn't go to the dry cleaner, safely with a Beatles garment because it became a hot property. But you can see the Milling style here. It's very close to the body. It's drawing influence from the continental style. It's got actually a very distinctive Milling signature with a high button on the lapel. These images are around the time of the release of the Beatles' first movie, A Hard Day's Night. So this is around 1964. But you can see the lean silhouette, especially when you compare the Beatles to the extras here that, wearing more of the boxy, baggy trousers. The Beatles were going for a very lean, close to the body silhouette, which was also what made them not only enticing, but menacing for some. As I mentioned, Millings is credited for creating hundreds and hundreds of looks, but perhaps he is most well known for this look, the so-called collarless jacket of 1962, in fact, is when it was first born, you could say, and it was as a result of a brainstorming session involving Dougie and Paul McCartney. And Millings worked with the Beatles to give the Beatles what they wanted. Remember, I was talking about how Brian was persuading them, okay, we got to smarten the look, to get more fame and fortune type of thing. Well, the Beatles were never in the hands of any stylists. They were never, let's say, any marketing puppet. They were never going to be told what to do. They only did what they wanted to do. To quote one of their songs, they dressed to please themselves. Please me. And they did please themselves by dressing how they wanted. So they wanted this collarless jacket, as I mentioned, and they knew it because of the origin. John Lennon especially was a Francophile. Paul kind of followed suit with John, but they knew of French style, and they knew of this designer, Pierre Cardin, who in 1960 launched one of the first menswear runway shows in Paris at the Hotel Crillon, and he launched what he called his cylinder suit. And you can see again the silhouette very close to the body, and pay attention to the different fabrications, especially this one here in corduroy. I wanted to get you to see that the Beatles themselves replicated it. You saw it in the, let's maybe go back to that, in the shark skin, okay, with the piping. But here it is in a corduroy version. Corduroy becomes very important in the Beatles fashion story. But there were other influences. My research shows, not just maybe some people look at them as tidy suit-wearing pop stars. No, the Beatles were always subversive. I like to always say there was a bit of a rebel yell in the lapel. So one of their very first influences was, in fact, from their own street style, which was the Teddy Boys, which was a quite violent but nattily dressed subgroup of fashionistas, should we say. There were some fashionistas in the group, but it was mostly young men wanting to ape their betters. Hence, what they're doing is Edwardian style. The nickname for Edward is Teddy, so it becomes Teddy Boy style. Please pay attention to the velvet collar. Remember, I said that rebel yell in the lapel. So the Beatles, even after they are working with such established designers and tailors such as Dougie Millings and others, they're asking for these little details to be put into their clothing because they are feeling an affiliation with the street, even though they're wanting also to be, as John would say, the toppermost of the poppermost. And this, again, you can really see the shark skin here, and you can see very much, I hope, how tight those pants were. Again, other influences, Gene Vincent. Let's look here at Gene Vincent, who has his blue caps, and also that rockabilly look. Here's where Paul and John, for the very first time, performed together. This was John's group, the Quarrymen, named for his school, Quarry Bank. And look at Paul and John are the only two wearing similar jackets. And again, it was Mr. McCartney who came in to John's group and said, I think we need to smarten up our look. And interestingly, right away, you see the identification of the next partners, the biggest songwriters in pop history, really. And you can see that the relationship is established there also through clothing. So fashion for the Beatles was never a afterthought. It was actually an integral part of image building, visual presentation, and band, if you might also say brand identity. I told you about just now about Gene Vincent and his blue caps. Unfortunately, there's not a color photo of this, but this is the Beatles in Hamburg in their leather stage, and they're wearing pink caps. They irreverently called them twat caps. But again, it was a direct homage to a rock and roll influence. And speaking of which, for them, Elvis was king. Marlon Brando was a style influence. Look at that leather jacket. Look at that cap. We're going to see that repeated in the Beatles' own look. Of course, they were mad for Little Richard. I think more the flamboyance, the idea that you could be who you wanted to be in your own way, in your own style. I've got a picture here again. This is from A Hard Day's Night. Ringo's wearing that cap, but more often you see John in that cap, but eventually all the Beatles have what eventually becomes known as a John Lennon cap. And again, the origin, in my opinion, is from the Marlon Brando. Another influence, Buddy Holly and the Crickets. I don't know how many Beatles fans are listening in. Maybe you already know this story, but it's not an accident that the Beatles are called Beatles. Crickets, Beatles, you get the point. And it was John who had, no, actually it was Stu Sutcliffe who suggested to him, and he went right with the idea, let's add an A, because it was a beat, a heavy beat sound from the Merseyside in England. But again, I wanted to show this picture because John Lennon, as George said, was blind as a bat. He did need the glasses. You know that you see him in glasses after 1966, the granny, round granny style lens. But when no one was looking, he was quite vain, John Lennon. And behind the scenes in the recording studio, he dressed, or, his prime accessory was a Buddy Holly homage. Again, other influences, the French cinema. I mentioned how John was a real Francophile. If you know the Beatles, you're going to see a lot of black turtlenecks, and you're going to see this, again, continental style of the Nouvelle Vague. What it all ended up being, all those different influences created a distinct Beatles look. There you see it here a little bit. See that lean leg, the black turtleneck. I haven't gotten into the boots yet. I'm about to in a minute, but high heel boots for men, especially the hair pushed forward. And even with Paul, tailored jacket. It was a distinctive, unique look because the Beatles, in a way, are like fashion in that they were always pursuing the new. They never wanted to be like anybody else, and they used fashion and clothing to distinguish themselves. And boy, was it explosive. Almost overnight, this is a picture from the day, the 1960s, Carnaby Street, in fact. Look at this, immediately, young men. You've got the collarless jacket. You've got the velvet on the jacket. You've got the Beatle boots. Look at those trousers. By the way, that was a Teddy Boyd influence. They were known as drain pipes, nicknamed drainies. And it was George Harrison who asked his mother to teach him how to use a sewing machine so he could make them so tight. But more the point is to see instantly the influence. And here, this is an ad from 1963, Boys Be a Hit. So even retailers, manufacturers were running after the Beatles in a sense to see what would be the latest trend, because the Beatles were selling fashion, even if that's not at all what they intended to do. I've often been asked this, why do I think that the Beatles had such an impact? And I think it's because they were the real deal. They were unique, and other fans wanted to be like them. They could, fans can spot a phony. The Beatles weren't phony. So you wanted to dress the way your idols were dressing. You wanted to be like them, emulate them. And here I was mentioning the Beatle boots. They actually started as a flamenco boot. And again, it was John and Paul, attuned to style. I think George says they actually saw another group in Hamburg wearing something high-heeled. And it was John and Paul on a night crawl. Remember, I mentioned earlier, bands members looking through windows to get ideas. And they saw this in the window of Agnello and David. I always was saying Davide, but I was corrected as Agnello and David, and in Shaftesbury. And they went the next day. And it was, I think, John who said, okay, right, we want 4 of everything. But again, they didn't just slavishly just take what was there. They Beatleified it. They added a higher heel. They added that side elastic. I like this picture of Paul because you can see too that what the boot was doing for them too was elongating the line. They even when they asked Dougie to make their suits, they ensured that there were no pockets, no front pockets, nothing bulky. They wanted that lean, mean, let's say turbocharged image. They were the future. And fashion instantly starts taking notice of them. So here is Vogue, and as well talking about the new, I beg your pardon, this Harper's Bazaar, talking about the new thing in England. Then it crosses the water, of course, to American Vogue. Diana Vreeland, she takes hold of or assessment of the energy that these Beatles and that whole youth movement that they were inspiring, and she gave it a name, Youthquake. In France, it was known as Yay Yay, more obviously linked to the Beatles, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. And again, you could see here, this is a Rule Britannia influence, because that's what this was. The Beatles were the de facto leaders of the so-called second British invasion that invaded America as of 1964, and it absolutely broke down all kinds of barriers, not only musically. I found a really fun quote from the father of one of the Beach Boys saying, complaining how by 1965, no American group could even chart anymore because it was all Brits, Brits, Brits. And so that British invasion didn't just include music, of course, as you can see here, it was fashion. And it became mainstream. I wanted to show you here, this is a Sears catalog and other things from America. And this is John Lennon in the movie Help. Again, corduroy, we're going to talk about that. Again, that cap, maybe a la Marlon Brando. But look at that, it's absolutely identical. Now, I mentioned to you that the Beatles didn't have any stylists. They did it their way, except for this young lady here named Astrid Kircher. And this is, again, she was sitting with them. This is on the set of A Hard Day's Night, 1964. So Astrid was a very beautiful, very talented, avant-garde photographer who first clamped eyes on the Beatles when they were playing on the Reeperbahn, which is Hamburg's red light district. And she instantly fell in love with them and the Beatles with her. And in fact, her aesthetic, she dressed, if you can see then, look at how chic that is, black leather trousers, head to toe black. She was known, called herself an existentialist. John Lennon nicknamed her and her friends, Klaus Vormann, for instance, the X's, and they took great inspiration from them, including, I hope you can see here, is the beginning of the so-called Beatles haircut. It was Astrid who pushed her hair forward, who cut it. Apparently, she got the influence from Jean Cocteau's, I think it's 1958 film Orphée, about the myth of Orpheus. And she got all her boyfriends to wash the grease out of their hair and push it forward. And the Beatles soon followed suit. But not too fast. I just wanted to show you what was the norm at this time. It actually had a couple of slang expressions. One was a duck's arse, or DA, because it would have a back part that apparently looks like the back end of a duck if you look closely. And also it was known as a Tony Curtis. And you can see before the Beatles washed that Brill cream, or maybe it was just Vaseline actually, out of their hair after meeting Astrid and Jürgen Vollmer and Klaus Vormann, in Hamburg. Paul and John, all the Beatles, they dressed their hair in that conventional style. But as soon as Astrid entered their lives, it was actually the great Beatles historian, Mark Lewison, has actually pinpointed the place, the day, the hour when the Beatles got the, as I say now, infamous, famous Beatles haircut, pushing it forward. And it was in Paris on the Rue de Bonne. And it was Jürgen Vollmer, who was Astrid's fellow photographer boyfriend, who was working at the time. And it was actually allegedly because John and Paul were having difficulty, as they said, pulling the birds or attracting the girls because their hair was repugnant to them. So this was already a continental style that the Beatles adopted, and then it went everywhere. And it became such a big deal as soon as they came to America. In fact, if you kindly get my book, or if you're interested in reading my book, you will see I devote an entire chapter to how everybody just like literally went hairy over the Beatles' hair. You had people weighing in, even Margaret Mead, the anthropologist in Red Book, writing columns about it, psychologists. What was this? Danger, danger, danger. It was effeminacy. It wasn't what men were supposed to do. This isn't how men were supposed to be. It drove the status quo mad. But of course, the fans knew that this was the ultimate. This was the best. This was the coolest. And they adopted it immediately. Boys, in fact, at the time were being expelled from school for dressing their hair a la Beatles. Even in your own America, you'll see there are cases that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And those who could not grow their hair, they had no problem replicating the Beatles look. This is Ed Sullivan wearing a Beatles wig. This was big bucks, big business. Wall Street Journal has reported on the millions of dollars in Beatles merch that was instantly manufactured and sold. By the way, the Beatles hardly got a dime out of that. I love this picture because it shows even the moms got into it. And she's probably, got her boy a DIY Beatles jacket because Butterick and other mainstream McCall's, other mainstream sewing companies were starting to issue Beatles jackets for people to make at home. And again, I want to show you this again. This is England now, but you see it. The long hair now it's the norm. And if sometimes for us from this present day, especially younger generation, you might say, well, what's the big deal? It's not even that long. But more what was outre was pushing it forward on the forehead. This was unconventional, and it was associated with laboring class, which the Beatles were all too keen to embrace. And it wasn't just the kids who were emulating them. This is the Byrds. This is the Stones. Everybody wanted to be like a Beatle, and I'm not kidding you. We could get into if there's a Stones fan in the crowd and you want to ask a question about it. But check out Brian Jones. He's got the Beatles haircut. He's got a Beatles jacket. He's got the velvet. It's all happening. The Beatles made it not only okay, but maybe a new value in masculinity, to care about your appearance, to groom yourself. And it had enormous influence. As I mentioned, when the status quo was going hairy over their hair, it was because it was seen as, I've just mentioned, anti-masculine. And then indeed, there was a whiff of the androgyny about the Beatles. But I also want to emphasize that the Beatles, they borrowed liberally from women, from the call and response girl groups. Some of you Beatle fans will already know that. Also from women's wear. And they had no, let's say, inhibition about experimenting and trying new things. And they were very confidently heterosexual. This was not a threat to them at all to embrace feminine elements, so-called feminine elements, into their wardrobe or their visual presentation. I want to draw your attention. It was, of course, a youth movement, and they represented not only now, as I mentioned, but the future. They were modern. And here's another group of young men, not so young, pardon me, but you all know them, the Rat Pack, and much more conventional, again, still, but it's the same time as the Beatles. So if you're a young person, who are you going to follow? Rhetorical question. As I mentioned, the Beatles' British invasion not only opened the pathways for other British bands to follow, and that includes the Stones. Keith Richards is quoted in my book as saying, "You don't understand what they did for all of us. They opened the doors." But what the Beatles did as well is that they opened the doors to British fashion, because that's what they were wearing. That's what people were seeing, especially once they started making their films like A Hard Day's Night and Help. Their look was being disseminated around the world. Remember, this is pre-Instagram, people. This is social media. This is ready access to lots of magazines. But the British style was now the style. I would draw your attention to Mary Quant here. She had actually started her bazaar shop on the King's Road in London in 1958. But as a result of the enormous fame and success of the Beatles. She, in a way, got a second life, as did other designers, such as the center picture here is Patty Boyd's sister, Jenny Boyd, who was the in-house model for Full and Tuffin. And it was the British Fashion Council, in fact, who hired the Queen Mary ocean liner and put British fashion on it, including Mary Quant and Full and Tuffin, and sent them into New York Harbor and invited fashion magazine editors and retailers to come and see and talk and be inspired. Fashion, as I mentioned to already, wasn't an incidental aspect of the Beatles' fame. And here you have the it girl of British fashion, and she is part of the Beatles' own program of the 1965 USA tour. In fact, and by the way, it's just blanking, Gene Shrimpton, known as the Shrimp. And so this is part of the Beatles' own program where you have this now adjacency, of music, Beatles music, and British fashion, British style. And in fact, I only recently found out that on the Atlanta leg of the Beatles' 1965 North American tour, the Atlanta opened with a London look fashion show. So again, that connection between the Beatles, pop music, Brit music, and London look British fashion was absolutely integrated. And I mentioned that you have the Americans coming on board of the Queen Mary and making new relationships. And especially it was J.C. Penney reaching out to Mary Quant, for instance, and having her do new lines for American customers. And they took even Diana Vreeland's Youthquake and made their own in-house label. Again, it was all about British style. And you can see it's still influential here. 1966, the cover of Life magazine. These four young men aren't even models. They're not, they're college kids. I read the magazine. At least that's what it says in the editorial there. But, they are distinctly a quartet, and they are distinctly, looking like the other guys on this screen. But the Beatles inspired and influenced all sorts of other aspects of even just in their daily wear. Maybe many of you are aware of the enormous success of the Shea Stadium concert in 1965, where again, it's all Dougie Milling's clothing up until this point, made for them, again, I think it was at Paul's request, a Nehru collar safari style jacket. And that Nehru collar becomes instantly, again, influential in the fashion, as I'm trying to show you here. And here here's an image, too, from a clothing pattern. And, of course, Sammy Davis Jr. Made it part of his own almost sartorial signature. And believe it or not, people, like if you close in there on George especially, George Harrison can be credited with inventing acid wash jeans. I do document that in the book, but who knew? So they, and here's also an example not only of the British style, that jacket that John's wearing and Ringo's wearing for sure are from London, but the rest of it, the denim is very much that relaxed Americana look that the Beatles just loved. And I often say that, when you are, let's say, the invaders, so to speak, you don't only bring your own influence, but you take from where you've invaded. And so this idea of denim, which now we just see as everyday, it wasn't an everyday fashion statement, especially in England, and the Beatles make it very fashionable. I mentioned to you at the very, very beginning to pay attention to corduroy. And here we're showing a little bit of that Cardin-inspired collarless jacket in corduroy. And it was corduroy, a working man's cloth. It was considered extremely déclassé at the time that the Beatles start wearing it. And why it was significant that Pierre Cardin made the original cylinder suits in corduroy is, many of you may know from your fashion history, that Cardin, though he was a couturier, he considered himself a fashion revolutionary. This, he was among the first across the floor, in fact, from women's wear, right? He was apprenticed to Dior. And he was wanting to ally himself with left bank intellectuals and the working class, the labor movement. And again, the Beatles 100% were behind that. So I think that it's corduroy, though at the time it wasn't popular, they made it so. You can see it especially here. Again, when they commissioned Dougie Millings to create their outfits for Help, here they are on Salisbury Plain in their faux military garb, very different shades of khaki, you might say, khaki green or army green. You see that, again, the epaulettes. But look again here at what George is doing. And this was a George Harrison innovation. He, again, remember, they like that lean silhouette, top to toe. And it was George who asked Dougie to get their footwear also made of corduroy, which, again, Gordon Millings confirmed for me they did do. And it actually became a trend. Small faces, different people at the time started wearing a corduroy footwear to the clubs. But I also wanted to show you that the trend persists. I just pulled this off the internet, and you can pay attention there. George Harrison inspired colored boots. So George was constantly wearing this kind of soft shoe in corduroy and designing it himself. It's another example of the Beatles innovating fashion on their own terms. Their wearing of corduroy actually is very impactful, especially in their native Britain, where corduroy also was known as Manchester cloth, made in the cotton mills in the north of England. Post-World War II, the British economy, admittedly, was in a slump. They might have helped to win the war, but they certainly were down in terms of their economy. And the Beatles helped turn that around magnificently. They, because they were wearing corduroy, corduroy became instantly in demand. Not only sales of their records and British style abroad, but as I mentioned, their British clothing and fashion, it brought literally billions to the British economy. The Beatles at this time are the ultimate soft power. And for this, their queen, Queen Elizabeth II, anoints them with the MBE, member of the British Empire, the very first pop group ever to be given such an honor. And again, all for corduroy sales. After this point, the Beatles take a sharp turn. They actually, remember I said they never wanted to be yesterday's men. They were always chasing after the new. And as I said, in a way, they are the epitome of fashion in that regard. They just decided after the movie Help and all that hoopla with the MBE, they were going to shift gears. And they start shopping in 1966 in the burgeoning London boutique scene. They are especially here wearing a kind of garb that was known as the Smarty suit, Smarty as in the candy. So you can especially see that here at the Ringo. And then you can see here in a 1966 press conference, all of a sudden a splash of color. Of course, you're seeing different silhouettes and different jacket cuts because these are now much more store-bought. They are frequenting Hung on You, started by Michael Rainey, seen here, who started with painted ties, but also you can see was flirting with 40s style. And the Beatles so loved it, they asked Michael to outfit them for their 1966 global tour. So this is as well where they played their last concerts in America. And you can see that pinstripe and then the paisley shirts. They also shopped at Granny Takes a Trip, located just down the street from Hung on You on the King's Road. And right now, the subject of a fabulous new book by Paul Gorman. I highly recommend it. And what you see here is not three different shops, but three different iterations of the same facade. Hung on, Granny Takes a Trip was constantly playing with its own image. It also was inspired by maybe not directly only 40s style, but vintage style. So now you're starting to get this mix of high and low fashion, and the Beatles loved it. George Harrison was immortalized here in a British postage stamp, his fashion, his jacket, a William Morris print, an upholstery fabric that the then resident tailor of Granny Takes a Trip, John Pierce, made, and for which George, as I said, looked absolutely fabulous. And that is also, I document that in my book. I've interviewed the tailor, John Pierce, about this jacket and the impact it had. As I mentioned, that the Beatles did things their own way. So they're not just pulling from their own British heritage. As you can see here, and again, Beatles fans in the audience might recognize this battered suede trucker jacket that John Lennon is wearing, because it's seen on the cover of the 1965 Beatles album, Rubber Soul. I allege that it is another homage to yet another musical, let's say, influence on the Beatles, which was Bob Dylan. But that relationship went two ways. As you may all know, Bob Dylan eventually goes electric, and not no small thanks to the Beatles. He goes to Carnaby Street. I'm hoping you're kind of starting to pick up there. He's even wearing Beatle boots, and he's wearing the striped tight trousers. So it was a kind of circular influence, American and British style. And here you see George Harrison. So that Western style was very much something that they all loved. And in fact, that's an image of George from the first 1964 American tour. I think he's on the Pigman Farm in Texas. But I also want to draw your attention here to that idea of today, we call it maybe global influences. This is a great one here to show that eclecticism of the Beatles. Now it's, again, pushing it forward, never leaning on what they had already done. And in fact, as I show you in my book, once the Beatles, in a way, accidentally established a fashion trend, they were off it. Remember that collarless jacket? Very, very big in Britain, 1963. They never wear it again after 1963. It never is a style that they want. And again, why they're moving on. So here you've got Ringo in a Nigerian dashiki. He's actually wearing a hung on you patterned blouse underneath it. And then you have the Beatles with the Maharishi getting into also Afghan sheepskin. And they are definitely, Paul and George, wearing hung on you frill front shirts. And here is the beginning of dandyism. And the Beatles were definitely poster boys for the new dandyism. Speaking of George Harrison, and speaking of global influences, you all may know that George was very interested in India, Indian culture, Indian music. He goes to study sitar in Bombay with Ravi Shankar. He comes back wearing Indian clothes. And again, what one Beatle wore, they were a tight brotherhood. All the others wore as well. And you can see on the other side here is actually a commissioned custom look by the Fool. I'll get into them in just a minute, but again, we'll show you that Eastern influence in Beatles clothing. The Beatles also drew great inspiration from a new trend that was popping up late 65 and really going gangbusters in 1966, which is militaria. And that also came across the pond, was huge in America as well. And this was, again, maybe you call it the vintage aesthetic. This was sort of the only decades since the end of empire, and there were plenty of army surplus warehouses filled to the brim with old military outfits. So it was a trend, and it was really basically, I'd say, anchored by a shop in England and London called I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet. John shopped there with Mick Jagger, and later Jimi Hendrix, follow suit. You all know that grenadier outfit. But here's the Beatles at the very beginning of 1967, wearing the militaria, wearing what you might call flea market finds, even though they're the richest men on the land, because they're creating a new look. And look at, they've grown their hair, they've grown their mustaches, and eventually that militaria becomes an ironic statement on the cover. This is the back cover, actually, of Sgt. Pepper, and also immortalized in their animation film, Yellow Submarine, which comes out in 1968. And again, credit to Mr. McCartney. It was he who said, you know, everyone's wearing these old clothes, these old military clothes. I know. Why don't we take that old idea, but dress it up with the shiniest, most fluorescent colors and fabrics we could find? He thought it was a tremendous stroke of irony. He is quite clever with that. And here you go. That's partly the story behind these very iconic now Pepper-esque military outfits. The Beatles in 1967 wanted to solidify their relationship with fashion in a way that no pop group before them, or indeed any celebrity really, had done before them, in that they opened their own fashion boutique. It was called the Apple Boutique, the very first manifestation of their own multi-pronged Apple business. Fashion was the first. Remember that before recording, before spoken word, before anything, it was fashion. And they commissioned a Dutch quartet, well, there actually is a Canadian in there, named The Fool, not necessarily because that meant they were stupid, but meant that it was the tarot card of the Fool that represented intrepid creativity. They were behind creating this cosmic mural on the facade of the Apple Boutique in the very unfashionable district of Paddington, known for Paddington Bear, and Baker Street, which is more known for Sherlock Holmes. And you can see how it instantly stands out. Paul McCartney has quipped that the Beatles grew up in an era of black and white, and they brought color to the world. And you really see that once they themselves launched their own fashion brand. I want to show you that these were the Fool's creations here, and this is Louis Vuitton. I think it's 2024 menswear. So you can see the influence. I'm going to get into that a little bit more, that the patterning, the flamboyance of color, as I said, pure creativity. Even the Fool themselves knew that this wasn't everyday garb that you would wear to the office, but you see eventually it becomes a fashion statement in its own right. And the Apple Boutique wasn't just a one-off. In 1968, the Beatles intensified their relationship with fashion by investing in a boutique that was on the King's Road, directly opposite Mary Quant's Bazaar, known at the time as Dandy Fashions, which once the Beatles got involved, was rebranded as Apple Tailoring. John Criddle was the front man. He actually wasn't the tailor. In fact, I've interviewed the real tailor behind some of these Edwardian style jackets, and that actually was his wife, Andrea Bissell, and you may know that name, or I'll tell you, they are the parents of Britain's numero uno ballerina, Darcy Bussell. So just a little side, and that's just John there again, wearing a vintage find at the opening of Apple Tailoring in May of 1968. And I wanted to show you this picture that you see the Beatles definitely embraced Andrea's styling for them, this longer waisted coat. And I love, okay, this is a little bit of the side, I love George's look there, but I wanted you to focus more on John and Ringo here to show you that they actually wore what they were selling. Then they go famously to India in 1968 after making sure that nobody would forget them by quickly turning out Lady Madonna. And I wanted to bring this into the talk tonight because one of the themes I noticed as I was doing my research is that the Beatles were in a constant state of transformation, metamorphosis, They would have, I mentioned to you, one look, they would let it melt away. It would allow for the conditions of a brand new identity through fashion, through clothing. So here they are in India. They shed their dandy fashions, they shed their color, they shed their peacock revolution garb, and they adopt a homespun Indian cloth, truly out of respect for the Indian culture and the Maharishi. I happen to know, again, I met somebody who was there at the same time as them. They had their Indian clothes made on site at the ashram by a man who was foot pedaling a Singer sewing machine on the ground. So that cleansing of a palette to provide a rebirth to fashion and style. Here you see John Lennon famously with his wife Yoko Ono on their wedding day, in fact, and he didn't abandon this new, cleaner palette. He has a new influence in his life. Yoko dressed head to toe in white or head to toe in black, and John definitely followed suit. She becomes a new inspiration in his life, as many of you will know if you know the Beatles story. But it wasn't just John who found a new partner, and it was Paul the same year, actually just ahead of John, which makes me sometimes think they had such a rivalry that John hurried to marry just weeks later. And here he's marrying American-born Linda Eastman. And I wanted to draw your attention to this. I'm glad I found it in color because, again, it showed to me, look at the connection of the colors. He's wearing his daffodil colored tie. She's got a daffodil colored coat on that day in April. And to me, again, you see a similar bond the way that Paul and John were dressing at the beginning. They were creative partners, and now the Beatles are each finding new partners. But their style at this time then becomes much more individualistic. In fact, maybe I just gave the word away. It becomes more pure style. It's no longer fashion. I maybe should hasten to add that the Beatles were never chasing after a trend. As John said, we were in the trend, But here I love this. This is, again, Beatles fans will know, this is the final photo shoot of the Beatles all together at John's Tittenhurst estate, late August 1969. I know that Paul is wearing Tommy Nutter from Savile Row. Possibly George is wearing, again, one of the Andrea Bustle Apple tailoring jackets, as is Ringo. But for any Canadians in the house, I found out that this jumpsuit, I was looking everywhere, thinking it was couture, thinking it was Cardin, whatever. And it was the mass fashion retailer in Canada known as Le Chateau. And they were very well known for this zip front unisex velour jumpsuit. And John got it when he did the bed-in in Montreal. But I love this image. This is the Beatles in the twilight, absolute twilight year of their existence together as a unified band. And in a way, to me, it's timeless. It's something I think we could all relate to today. And in fact, many people are relating to it today and drawing immense inspiration for it. Hedi Slimane, for instance, you may know him as the designer or former designer at Celine and Yves Saint Laurent Homme, for instance. He loves the Beatles, and he's constantly, or had been constantly, ransacking their collective closet for his design ideas. I mean, hello, look at the jacket, the head to toe leather, it's not accidental. Tom Ford put out a line of John Lennon glasses. This was Hermes of just over a year ago. Remember the caps? Remember A Hard Day's Night? Even if they're not directly saying Beatles inspired, to me, it's Beatles inspired. Ringo Starr's always rocking it, always has had a distinctive sense of style. Tommy Nutter, I just mentioned his name. He was kind of the new kid on the Savile Row block around the time of Apple in 68, 69. And his master tailor was Edward Sexton, who made the suits for Abbey Road. But here I wanted to show you, this is post-Beatles. This is Ringo in Vogue magazine modeling Tommy Nutter for Holland and Sherry, providers of fine cloth for menswear since the 18th century. And in fact, Holland and Sherry was the cloth that Dougie Millings used when he outfitted the Beatles for A Hard Day's Night. Go forward 2014, here's John Varvatos asking and selecting and paying fabulous tribute to Ringo Starr as the model and muse of his menswear collection. And of course, I've been talking about Paul McCartney, and I was going to quip earlier, but I'll quip it here. Now we know where Stella gets her chops. Dad was never immune to fashion. And in fact, again, with my research, and I had the great fortune of talking to Edward Sexton before he passed away. And in fact, Stella, just last week, I think, if you go on her Instagram, she's starting to, she's got an Instagram post, it's fantastic, talking about tailoring and that tradition. And when she was at Central St. Martin's going and studying with Edward Sexton to learn about tailoring. And of course, she also mentioned she drew inspiration from her dad and her mom's gender fluid style. And so that's something maybe you could all look up now. But this was just last year. So I wanted to say the black and white, to me, Very Hard Day's Night, and both are only surviving Beatles now, sadly, Ringo and Paul, both front row at Stella's show. And it's not just high fashion. This is Ben Sherman, to me, very distinctive Beatle silhouette from the Beatlemania era. And here you go, it's H&M doing that Sgt. Pepper, I Was Lord Kitchener's valet style. There you see it on John. And in your own New York City, Alice and Olivia just last year released a limited edition Beatles-inspired capsule collection of clothing. I had the great honor of going down to the meat packing district to their flagship and seeing the clothes in person. And just to bring it forward, I'm always, so maybe I haven't said it yet, but my thesis is that the Beatles have never gone out of style. So I'm frequently just, when we've got right now menswear and fashion shows, and it is going to be Fashion Week in New York, I'm often looking to see, okay, please, I didn't just make this up, right? So this is Craig Green from the UK, who was presenting his new multicolored patterned clothing line for spring summer. It's going to be in the stores. Again, go to Craig Green's Instagram. You can see it's already starting to be released. And it is now deliberately Beatles inspired. He did an interview with Wallpaper and different publications where he talked about the Beatles styling. There you see some of the color there, but the patterning. But it wasn't just taking from the clothing. I interviewed Anna Swee, by the way, for the book, and she said something similar. It was their intrepid creativity, their willingness to dare to wear, to be different, to dress, to express. And of course, their impact not only has inspired fashion designers, but also all of pop culture. Here's just an example, the Austin Powers franchise. What the costume designer is on record saying that her main inspiration was George Harrison. And again, goes right to other bands. It showed you at the very beginning, other musicians, like you'd say, colleagues or peers drawing inspiration. Well, here's once the Beatles break up, the late now Ozzy Osbourne wearing John Lennon glass. He was a huge Beatles fan. This is the Knack. 100% are dressing Beatlemania, black and white, if you look at them. Even Kiss is in here. I have Gene Simmons quoted in the book saying they gave bands, I guess, license to, as I mentioned, dress to express, but to create a band identity through fashion. And bringing it right up to the present day, the Korean boy band BTS. They're not actually, I thought they were done, but they're on a tour coming soon. And you can see directly the influence. And they are on the record again saying the Beatles were an influence. And they went to Tom Brown in London to ask for a Beatles-esque wardrobe. And I kind of joke maybe what the idea is like to dress like a Beatle is that you hope some of the magic might wear off. But as I mentioned to you, to me, their look is timeless, that the Beatles have never gone out of style. If you saw these four guys walking down the street today, I don't think you would say that's 60 years old. I think it looks fresh, current, and it really does encapsulate what made the Beatles great, memorable, and why we want to still emulate them and draw inspiration from them all these days later. Thank you very much for your attention. That is the conclusion of my talk. And I hope I've left room for comments or questions. And here's my book and some write-ups about my book. Thank you.
Oh my gosh, that was amazing. Oh my word.
Thank you.
Like I'm like, oh, I have to say, I have to, and I think I'm not the only one who agrees with this, but I agree with you. Their look is
Thank you.
absolutely timeless. That
Yeah.
is the perfect one word definition of them. They're absolutely timeless. But I actually have a question for you. The about their hair. Now,
Mhm.
they went from like the 50s, like
Mhm.
the slacking back. Like,
Yep.
do you know which Beatle actually started and said, "Hey, let's get this grease out of our hair and just think." I think you mentioned it, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure. I
it's
didn't catch it.
100% was the two of them. It was John and Paul.
Oh,
They
who
were,
did say?
again,
Okay.
sorry guys, I didn't say this yet, but if it's not obvious, I love these guys. I've been a Beatles fan from childhood. I nerd out. I know all these little factoids, so bear with me. So I happen to know that it was John and Paul on a trip to what was supposed to be Spain.
Hmm.
John's 21st. He got a whack of cash from a more, let's say, wealthy relative up in Scotland. As I said, they were hitchhiking their way, meant to go to Spain, but let's detour into Paris, and they never left Paris. And it was there, as I mentioned, they were seeing the style. They were shopping at the Clignancourt flea market. They wanted to pull, as they said, that's quote from them. We wanted to pull the French birds, but their hair was for them de gueule, which is French for disgusting. And so Jurgen, already because he was Astrid's boyfriend, she got all her boys to push their hair forward and wash that crap out of the hair. And it was John and Paul. And as I say, if you want more detail, I do mention it. I give credit to Mark Lewison, great historian, and that's where it happened. It happened in a hotel on the left bank in Paris on a particular day. And I know that they came back to Liverpool, and I think it was George like, "Hey, your hair's funny." Actually, now I'll kind of elaborate on this part. So, but George, he was, as you saw, part of the original core group was the three of them. And I didn't get into it, but remember I said that they had difficulty holding on to drummers. So at this time, they had a drummer named Pete Best. He was maybe the original drummer. He went with them to Hamburg. Check out photos of all John, George, Paul, and Pete. And you're going to see that Pete was stubbornly not going to change his Tony Curtis. He was not going to wash it out. He was not pushing it forward. There are many explanations as to why the Beatles ultimately fired him and found Ringo and brought Ringo into the fold. But in my opinion, it's because he refused to conform to what was becoming a uniform Beatles style. And in fact, I have that in the book as well. When Ringo was invited to join the Beatles, he was told he had to change his hairstyle. And Ringo makes the joke, they had changed my style up and down, but that was it. And I always make a joke that I guess Ringo knew what happened to Pete, so he wasn't going to hold back about the hair.
Interesting. It's fascinating. So, and also too, I mean, their manager, Brian Epstein, I mean, I think he was instrumental too in terms of their fashion. Like
Absolutely.
he actually, I mean, was it him who actually told them, look, you guys have to change your look? He was like really looking to really do a major branding. I mean, in essence, when they changed into suits, they were branding themselves and making and distinguishing themselves from the typical bands that had, like, let's say, the leather jackets.
Well, actually, bands didn't wear leather jackets in the day. It was the Beatles who were the first to wear leather jackets, and it created quite the furore because
Mm.
they got their leather in Hamburg in 1960. And when they come back to Liverpool, in fact, that's a really, I think, cool moment in Beatles' story is that when they come back to Liverpool wearing black leather, that actually was shocking because, au contraire, bands did wear suits in the day. And in fact, the New Musical Express had given advice to all bands who wanted to make it that you had to have a uniform look. And if you look again at, it was the ubiquity of Merseyside bands at the time, everybody did have a suit. And in fact, when the Beatles went to Hamburg for the very first time, hello, Paul McCartney again made the suggestion to the others that they get outfitted in suits. And his neighbor was a tailor, and Paul bought lavender cloth. And they had, again, you can go online, you can see that sort of a very early Hamburg Beatles in just right, Beatles lavender jackets. You're going to see it. And those were custom made for them because they wanted to dress Natalie. They wanted to dress for success. And in fact, where did Paul really got that idea was on that very first Scottish tour when they were the Silver Beatles. They saw them thrashing about in black, not really knowing what they were doing, because the headliner on that tour was Johnny Gentle, and he told the Beatles, you got to dress smart to make an impression. That really stayed with McCartney. But
Yeah.
what happens in Hamburg is it was the red light district. They're performing for prostitutes, pimps, gangsters. They are forced to do long 8-hour sets at a time. And in order to keep it going, they were popping a lot of amphetamines. They were literally frothing at the mouth. They were carrying on. And again, you can see that I have, I think, a picture of that in my book, where those beautiful lavender togs, literally melt away from the beer, the sweat, the sex, you name it, the pills. And that's when the Beatles, again, remember I said that they always are almost in a cycle of reincarnation through fashion or style. So they get rid of those McCartney inspired or, suggested suits in Hamburg. And that made them ripe for Astrid Kirchherr when she walks in and they go, right, really dig what she's wearing, head to toe, black turtleneck, black leather. She takes them in Hamburg to get the black leather. So when you okay, so I'm going to answer your question more about Brian Epstein. So what I wanted to say is because that is opposite, that is Brian pushed them into suits. So I think I've established no, he did not, because the Beatles already experimented with that. But what he suggested, they really liked their leather look, but now they knew they could only go so far with it. And if they wanted to go on television, they couldn't look scary like that. They couldn't look menacing and rough. I call them the savage young Beatles at this time. They were actually quite terribly behaved. And everyone talks about that. The Stones, by contrast, were way more civilized, way more, from middle-class homes and sophisticated in that regard. So the Beatles did carry on, and they really liked that rough, tough leather look. But so it was, and frankly, Brian was turned on by it too. He's very attracted to it. And in fact, the very first photo session he did for promotional materials, he had them pose in their leathers. So, but he knew, again, he wanted, and that's why they signed on to a manager. They wanted to do bigger and better and go better places. And he did suggest to them, okay, then I think we have to go more into suits. And that's when he introduces them, to his tailor, and the rest goes on.
Yeah, and I want to go fast forward to their boutique.
Mhm.
Is that building still there? Is the mural
Yes, it's still
it
there. It
is still
is.
there? Oh,
Yes,
fantastic. Okay, so
yes.
yeah, that's
It's
fantastic.
in fact, if you can believe this, I had the great privilege of doing a book launch in UK, on Savile Row, everyone, right? Kitty corner to number 3, which was Beatles headquarters at Holland and Sherry, that makers of the cloth that I told you about. And a girlfriend, a Canadian girlfriend, very kindly, she does business in the UK. She had a business apartment. And can you believe it? When I show up at her apartment, like, no way. I was literally 27 steps, I counted them, from that corner. I was on the same street on Baker Street, staying there. So I can tell you, I went inside. It was a real estate agency, and they very kindly took me downstairs to show me. So I got a feel for where the dressing rooms were. And they do have big blow up pictures of the Beatles and the scene. It was super exciting for me. So I would encourage any of you want to do a Beatles tour. That's something you want to put on your list.
Oh, that's fantastic. Wow, I'd have to check that out. Let's see. I wanted to ask you also, I know we have only we're way over time.
Oh, shoot.
Just a few
Sorry.
more, just no, it's fine. No, no, this is so much an actuality. I mean, if people want to find out more information about fashioning of the Beatles, then they should really purchase your book, and which is
Yeah, and
available.
I'm totally open to, I don't know if you that's your protocol, but I could give you my email address. I'm
Well, they
you can
have your
see I'm such
Instagram
a
right now.
fan, and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to spread the word.
Well,
So,
they can write to you on Instagram,
yep,
and
yeah,
you,
definitely.
you have your handle there, and
Yeah, and yeah.
yeah, and
No,
I
go
wanted
ahead.
to
Sorry about
ask
that.
you, no, I wanted to ask you, like it seems as though that the direction they wanted to be in suits, and then later when they constantly went through a metamorphosis, if you will, and
Yeah. Hmm.
they changed their look pretty pretty often actually. But like for example, the military suits and and also when they took the trip to India, and I'm assuming they took the trip to India because after Brian Epstein passed away, I guess they needed something that was different, like some kind to help them shake their grief. Um, I could be wrong about that, but regardless, I think they needed a change. And yeah, I think what was the question? My question was what surprised you most about your research, actually?
Okay, that's a good one. I hope this doesn't sound conceited, and it's not conceited, but I mean, like, it's self-serving. But honestly, one of the biggest surprises when I was doing the research, that nobody had done this before. Like, in a way, now that I've pointed it out to you, now that I'm showing you the through line, even Hermes, hello, you know, it's, honestly, when I was doing the research, I kept going, how come nobody's done this before? This is such a gold mine. And not only a gold mine of information, but in terms of the culture of the 60s of British fashion. But for me, it was this amazing lens onto the Beatles that nobody had dared open before.
Yeah.
And it revealed even more to me their innate genius, their originality, their
Mhm.
creativity, that sense of constant evolution, or as I said in the beginning, I said kind of a revolution, that they were doing it their way, and they just cleared a path and started so much that we now take for granted, and they gave us such gifts. So I think, honestly, maybe biggest surprise. Oh, okay. I've mentioned a few times there about McCartney. Like, I could not believe it. It's every turn, it's like, get out. He did that again. He's doing it again. He's doing it again. But again, any Beatles fans listening in, you kind of, well, I hope you do know about that Paul, he's actually is an avant-garde figure. John is often credited with being the original avant-garde Beatle, but actually it was Paul. And believe it or not, I was always a John girl. Okay, this is because I'm speaking from Paul bias. And then I absolutely fell in love with George as a teenager. Of course, I used to have his poster in my room and kiss it every morning. so that was my rite of passage. I thought he really was Gorgeous George, as he was nicknamed in the day, but I digress. Anyway, I think that was one of the maybe a bigger revelation was again about Paul's input in the direction that he shaped for the Beatles, quite literally in clothing too.
Yeah. All right. One more quick question, and that is, has Paul or Ringo contacted you about this
No,
book?
okay. That's kind of like, if
And
you
are
could see
you are
me,
you
I'm
asking?
blushing. I'm blushing here because, so firstly, I actually didn't contact them because I did get the endorsement by, as I say, the world's greatest Beatles historian living today, Mark Lewison. At the beginning, I went to him and I told him I had the idea, and he heartily endorsed me and encouraged me. But he gave me words of wisdom right at the start. He says, don't try to contact them. He said that the Beatles do not take kindly to others making maybe a name for themselves, or maybe more crudely, a buck off their fame. And remember, I showed you that's a little glimpse there of the Whigs. As I mentioned, the Beatles got royally ripped off. Oh, they made a lot of people rich. People probably know now, again, that Paul doesn't, and John, they didn't even own their own music at the end. Paul still doesn't own it. Everybody else got rich. So I kind of respected that, and I respect them so much. So I kind of, that's why the book took me, we didn't talk about it, it was on and off a decade of research. Let's put it into context. I did a book of 500 years of ballet history, and it took me 6 months. Why? Because everything was documented. You had records, you had somebody, other people had, taken time to give histories of dancers, and dancers wrote about themselves. Whereas the Beatles, and nobody had written about their fashion before. So it was about finding them in their own words. What did they say about clothing? So the anthology, the Beatles anthology, was a key resource for me, but also going and then finding key people who are still alive. I mentioned Redwood Sexton, but I also found their hairdresser, Leslie Cavendish, also has a Beatles book out. I highly recommend it, was a protege of Vidal Sassoon. So I got to meet certain people, and Robert Orbach of I Was Lord Kitchener's valet, and I said John Pierce and Andrea Bustle. I mentioned, so talking to those people and then piecing that together, and then finding out about magazines that no longer exist. So you didn't know what you didn't know, like Fab 28 and Honey magazine, and trying to find copies because people didn't take these girl magazines, fan magazine, teen magazines, pop group magazines. They weren't considered serious, just in a way that I think fashion often gets short shrift here, right? Like there's whole books written on this now, so I don't need to preach to the converted in the house. But that idea that fashion was always on the lower ranks of being taken seriously, that's maybe the only reason I can think of as to why all these Beatles scholars and a million words and documentaries have been made on them. And then nobody spilt any ink on their fashion before. And then I did. So that's maybe getting back to
Wonderful.
that's what really astonished me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to just thank you so much
Oh, thank
for
you.
this amazing program. We can go on for hours and hours
Trust me,
talking
we
about the
could.
Beatles. And thank God the Beatles came out with their fashion, because I don't know what we would look like today without them. So I want to thank you, Deirdre, and for this amazing program. And this has been a production of the National Arts Club. Thank you for joining us.
And thank you for having me. All the best, everyone.